Greetings and citations, my fellow sovereigns. This is the Vocational Science of Freedom Saturday Night Civics and Sovereignty class, and tonight we will be continuing our reading, once again, of the book called The Great Taking. And I believe we left off at chapter 8, and if you'd like to join in on the Vocational Science of Freedom classes, you can join our Gilded server for free. The link is gilded.gg/VSOF, and you can find that link on the Vocational Science of Freedom YouTube page right here. And it's also in all of the show notes for all of the classes on all the platforms, whether it be Rumble, on YouTube, or on Odyssey. So, let's get back to where we left off. Bank holiday. They have bartered their birthright for a mess of pottage. William Blake. My Aunt Elizabeth had been 10 years old when the banks were closed by executive order in 1933. When I asked her to tell me about the Great Depression, she said that suddenly no one had any money, that even wealthy families had no money, and had to take their daughters out of private schools because they could not pay the tuition. I wondered why even these wealthy families could not send their children back to those schools after the banks were reopened. The answer is that only the Federal Reserve banks and banks selected by the Federal Reserve were allowed to reopen. The Federal Reserve banks, writes Alan Meltzer, quote, sent the Treasury lists of banks recommended for reopening, and the Treasury licensed those it approved, close quote. Meltzer's study, A History of the Federal Reserve, is considered the most comprehensive history of the Federal Reserve Central Bank. I have not yet read that book. I think we should probably find it. It's probably in PDF, I'm guessing, probably available to be grabbed off of archive.org. And if we find it, then I will certainly add it to the reading list for this class. To continue. People with money in banks that were not allowed to reopen lost all of it. Right. Maybe I should reread that. People with money in banks that were not allowed to reopen lost all of it. So it wasn't just a bank holiday. It was, let's steal everyone's money in every single account, in every single bank that isn't run by the Khazarian mob. Isn't that convenient? And if you don't think they're going to do that again, or they can do that anytime they wish to, just close the bank, take everything. You're not paying attention to history, because that's exactly what they did back then. And on top of it, they also stole all of the gold from the people by a completely unlawful executive order that ordered everybody to turn in their gold and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve Bank on penalty of, I believe, $10,000 fine and I don't know how many years in federal prison. Did Roosevelt have any capacity or power to do this? No, he just did it. He even admitted in a book called On Our Way that he didn't have the authority to do this. So, why are we still dealing with it? But anyway, to continue. Their debts were not canceled. However, these were taken over by the banks selected by the Federal Reserve System. If these people could not make their debt payments, which was now likely since they had lost their cash, they lost everything they had financed with any amount of debt, e.g. their house, their car, and their business. So what did the Khazarian mob do? They stole everything in 33. And how did they do this? By the manipulation and the corruption of law through the attorney. To continue. Thousands of banks were never allowed to reopen. The grand facades of former bank buildings could be seen around Cleveland. There was such devastation of banks that a neighborhood Catholic church was built with massive stone columns salvaged from a bank building which had been demolished. The Cleveland Trust Company had grown through acquisition to become, by 1924, the sixth largest bank in the United States. As noted by Case Western Reserve University Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, quote, the bank survived the Depression well. Close quote. How was that possible? It was selected by the Federal Reserve to consolidate debts. I had a finance professor who told the class that Cleveland Trust had run a systematic process of foreclosing upon and evicting many thousands of families from their homes in the greater Cleveland area. After these families were evicted from their homes and their equity wiped out, they were offered the possibility of moving back into their former homes as renters. The advantage to Cleveland Trust being that these families would pay to keep their houses heated until they could be sold. Cleveland Trust did, quote-unquote, well. How did my finance professor know about this? His family was one of those many thousands of families whose home mortgage had been taken over by Cleveland Trust. Contrast this with the cheery image conveyed by William L. Sleeber, who was a member of the Economic Advisory Panel of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In his article, Why Did FDR's Bank Holiday Succeed? Always leave it to someone who's an economist or an attorney to make a sentence like that. No one else would think this was a success except those that stole everything. Silver writes, much to everyone's relief, when the institutions reopened for business on March 13th, depositors stood in line to return their hoarded cash to neighborhood banks. Within 2 weeks, Americans had redeposited more than half of the currency that they had squirreled away before the suspension. The market registered its approval as well. On March 15th, 1933, the first day of trading after the extended closure, the New York Stock Exchange recorded the largest one-day price increase ever. Of course they did. Why? Because the Khazarian mob crushed everything, bottomed out all the prices prior to, which is exactly what they did in England when they pretty much took over the totality of the rest of the English Empire after the Battle of Waterloo. When the Rothschilds started to sell everything, and then they started to whisper in the streets that England had lost the Battle of Waterloo to Napoleon. And then there was a panic, and everything dropped to zero, practically. And then the Rothschilds started to buy everything up. And then when the news came in that, in fact, England did not lose that battle to Napoleon, everything skyrocketed. And that's how the manipulation of these markets works by the Khazarian mob. That's why you never, ever invest anything in any stock market, ever. Period, full stop. Unless, of course, you want it stolen. But to continue. With the benefit of hindsight, the nationwide bank holiday in March 1933 ended the bank runs that had plagued the Great Depression. Contemporary observers considered the bank holiday and the fireside chat the 1-2 punch that broke the back of the Great Depression. Who caused the Great Depression? The same people that were in league with Roosevelt. And to make another side note about history here, you got to remember that during this time is when all of the state governors committed treason and traveled to D.C. and pledged all of the registered property that had been registered in the state side to who? The federal government, so that they could take out loans from this Luciferian bank. They all committed treason. None of them had the authority to do what they did either. But this is what happens to people who register their property. Anything that's registered under Roman civil law, you do not own it. You have the right to use it. And that's how they split title between legal title and equitable title. Equitable means you have the right to use it. You become what's called a usufructuary. Legal title means that you actually do own it and can do with it what you want. You actually possess it. Under Roman civil law, that's the holder of the actual title. In common law, there is no splitting of title. You either hold something in allodium or you don't. That's it. So, this is how they did all this. And what did the Khazarian mob really want as pledge from the state governors? It wasn't the land. It wasn't even the houses. You know what it was? It was the people. The people. The ones that are registered by birth certificate. That's what they really wanted. They wanted the productive value that was registered on the state level. And that's what all this was about. And that's why we still live under a system that the attorney controls by the administration of abandoned infant estates. And why they really did what they did in 33. To continue. The speed with which the Bank Holiday Act reestablished the integrity of the payment systems demonstrates the power of credible regime-shifting policies. God, is that a cringy sentence or what? Anyway, the Emergency Banking Act of 1933 had been passed by Congress on March 9th, 1933, 3 days after FDR declared the bank holiday. You think he was holding that over them as a threat? You bet. With only a single copy available on the floor of the House of Representatives. Oh my God, I didn't even know that. That's insane. So nobody read it. Of course not, right? And with copies being made available to senators as the bill was being proposed in the Senate after it had passed the House. Was it successful? We are led to believe that the bank holiday was a brilliant scheme. Well, it was, for some. It was enormously successful for those banking interests who took the assets and consolidated their power. It certainly demonstrated the power of regime-shifting policies. We will see that it was not just about taking people's homes and other stuff. As to ending the panic, perhaps that is not so difficult to do when you have fomented the panic. In the Wikipedia article, The Great Depression, we find the following illumination of the Fed's odd behavior in the years leading up to the bank holiday. The monetarists' explanation was given by American economist Milton Friedman and Anna J. Schwartz. They argued that the Great Depression was caused by the banking crisis that caused 1/3 of all banks to vanish, a reduction of bank shareholder wealth, and more importantly, monetary contraction of 35%, which they called the Great Contraction. Right, because when the banks take all the money out of circulation, that will stop any economy. That's what they did. By not lowering interest rates, by not lowering rates, and by not injecting liquidity into the banking system to prevent it from crumbling, the Federal Reserve passively watched the transformation of a normal recession into the Great Depression, which that's exactly what was planned. The Federal Reserve allowed some large public bank failures, particularly that of New York Bank of the United States in December 1930, which produced panic and widespread runs on local banks, and the Federal Reserve sat idly by while banks collapsed. Friedman and Schwartz argued that if the Fed had provided emergency lending to these key banks or simply bought government bonds on the open market to provide liquidity and increase the quantity of money after the key banks fell, all the rest of the banks would not have fallen after the large ones did, and the money supply would not fallen as far as and as fast as it did. Well, of course, that's what they wanted to happen, so they would have never done that. This view was endorsed in 2002 by Federal Reserve Governor Ben Bernanke in a speech honoring Friedman and Schwartz with this statement. Let me end my talk by abusing slightly my status as an official representative of the Federal Reserve. I would like to say to Milton and Anna regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again. An admission of guilt. As this is, quote-unquote, ancient history, it was safe for Bernanke to make such an admission. But more to the point, it would allow him to posture as the wise man who had studied the quote-unquote mistakes of the Federal Reserve, and then to justify the Fed's extraordinary measures to follow in the global financial crisis, which of course was the destruction of the housing bubble, which of course they again created. Is the Fed indeed, quote-unquote, very sorry? Can one believe the promise that, quote, we won't do it again? Yeah. They have studied the lessons of the past in detail. However, their purpose has been to prepare a new and improved global version of the spectacular end of this debt expansion supercycle. That's what this book is about. Contrary to the image of success, which has been handed down to us, the bank holiday did not end the Great Depression. There was no recovery, which might have allowed people to service their debts and keep their property. Why was that? Inexplicably, the Federal Reserve kept conditions tight. According to literature on the subject, the possible causes were a contraction in the money supply caused by Federal Reserve and Treasury Department policies and contradictory fiscal policies. If that was a comprehensive program to assume there would be no recovery, it worked quite well. Conditions remained broadly stressful for years, and they kept price levels down, so that people had no opportunity to sell assets for paying off debts. I know from family letters that, despite having no debts, times were quite tough. Grandma Webb wrote to her son, who was in a youth athletic program on an army base, about Grandpa Webb having been out trying to get any work for Webb equipment. That was in 1936. Contrary to the image of FDR as a savior, the people in my family who lived through the 30s considered FDR to be something like Satan himself, and they were not religious people. Yeah, it makes sense, because they're all Luciferians, and that's exactly who they work for. To continue. Here's an interesting quote from Sleeber, might not be pronouncing that correctly. The Emergency Banking Act of 1933, passed by Congress on March 9th, combined with the Federal Reserve's commitment to supply unlimited amounts of currency to reopen banks, created de facto 100% deposit insurance. So according to William L. Sleeber, who was economic advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Fed miraculously and suddenly in March of 1933 had the means, quote, to supply unlimited amounts of currency to reopen banks, close quote, which were, of course, only the banks selected by the Federal Reserve System. Clearly, the Fed had the means all along to avoid the failure of those thousands of banks. A panic can be fomented easily when you run the system. They made it happen, they planned it, and then brought their solution after they got their regime-shifting policies in place. The Federal Reserve System and the banks selected by the Fed were prepared to take things from people on a vast scale. Their homes, their cars, and even their new electric appliances, which had been sold to them with the innovation of customer credit. Right, because all of this customer credit didn't exist until shortly before this period of time. And they were testing it out to see how far out they could put people into debt before they crushed everyone. And then they thought, well, that worked pretty well beforehand, so let's reopen it and restart it again. And then they did it in the 40s and 50s and 60s, where they sold this kind of domestic bliss to everyone who came back from the war and afterwards. Oh, just go put it on credit card. You can get it and just pay it later, Right. Did the bankers need to take this property? What was their real purpose? ? Can you get past the idea that they were trying to help? ? Even if we can, we are always led to think about this in a small way. That is always about a natural human greed for money and for material things. It was not then, and it is not now. Ask yourself, if they don't want your money, and they don't really want or need your stuff, and they're not trying to help you, what do they want? What's the point of all this, of their efforts? This may be difficult to hear. It was deliberate strategy. It was about ultimate, complete power, allowing no centers of resistance. And so it was about deprivation. It was about subjugation. And it still is, in more ways than we know. Well, with the exception of the people that have learned from the Vocational Science of Freedom, they know. To continue, it was not about helping people then, and it's not about helping people now. It is all about the same deliberate herding of humanity and elimination of any pockets of resistance, which plagues us still. Us meaning them. While Cleveland is now a crumbling city, it was a center of incredible prosperity in the 1920s. The Federal Reserve Bank building in Cleveland was completed in 1923, less than 10 years after the signing of the Federal Reserve Act. The bank vault is the largest in the world, and it incorporates the largest hinge ever built. It seems they were preparing to put a lot of stuff in there, and for the possibility that there might be some stress about that. Perhaps it was not to be filled with refrigerators, washing machines, and toasters. There are machine gun turrets above the sidewalk on the street level. There was a larger objective. The preparatory work had been laid when the Federal Reserve System was secretly planned, which, if anybody doesn't know, that was on Jekyll Island. And if you want to know the full and read the full history of that, just get G. Edward Griffin's book, Creature from Jekyll Island, and you will learn how and when they planned it. And with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in the quiet before Christmas of 1913, which I will add when 75% of Congress was already home on holiday, the Federal Reserve Act set up an inevitable logic that the Fed must take the gold of the public in a sufficiently major crisis with the justification that credit could not be expanded otherwise. This is exactly what is now set up to happen with all securities owned by the quote-unquote public globally. Right, because you registered it. See, back then they had to threaten you with jail time or $10,000 fine. And if you were stupid enough to give them your gold, well, then you did so. So what do you need to do this time? Stop registering everything. Take everything out of the banks. There should be a bank run tomorrow, but it's caused by us. Just collapse the whole bloody system. Only use gold and silver as tender in payment of debt, as it clearly states in Article 1, Section 10 of the Federal Constitution. And stop giving these Luciferian filth your energy. That's how you end it. That's how all of us end it together. It's not that difficult. You just have to stop supporting these Luciferian filth. And then they won't have anything. Because a leech only continues to suck off you as a parasite until you decide not to remove it. It's your choice. Is the leech ever going to stop being a leech? No. Are the Luciferians ever going to stop being parasites? No. So just understand that and get rid of them. Remove them from your life. Remove them from your existence. Do not let them take one more ounce of your energy or your blood. Simply. That's it. Stop registering your property. Take everything out and do not play in their system. So how do you create wealth? You keep gold and silver. Because gold and silver is the only thing that is actually money anyway, as was stated by J.P. Morgan in congressional hearings. So, to continue. This is exactly what is set up to now happen with all securities owned by the public globally. Here is an important excerpt from the Wikipedia article on Executive Order 6102. The stated reason for the order was that hard times had caused quote-unquote hoarding of gold. However, the main rationale behind the order was actually to remove the constraint on the Federal Reserve, preventing it from increasing the money supply during the Depression. The Federal Reserve Act, 1913, required 40% gold backing of Federal Reserve notes that were issued. By the late 1920s, the Federal Reserve had almost reached the limit of allowable credit in the form of Federal Reserve demand notes, which could be backed by gold in its possession. Right. So what did the Luciferians have to do? They had to allow a different percentage of their filthy notes, because their whole entire purpose is always to create something out of nothing. Always. That's their whole purpose. So they create something out of nothing. It's backed by the demand or the promise to pay in real assets, and then they always get the real assets when they continue to create more and more of something out of nothing until it's worthless. Right? Sound familiar? That's how every single fiat currency works. It's an exponential curve. It's mathematical certainty. And it's never, ever resulted in anything else. It's always ended up that way. So to continue, the executive order to confiscate all gold owned by the public was made under the authority of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Get that? It's a very important piece of law history there. So this executive order to confiscate the gold owned by the public was made under the authority of the Trading with the Enemy Act. How'd they do that? Well, because the American people were basically considered the enemies of the United States Federal Corporation. Right? That's how they did it. And you are still considered an enemy combatant if you're actually on the other side. But of course, now they're getting to the point where once you're on the other side, they won't touch you anymore. But anyway, to continue. Okay, which had been enacted 4 years after the creation of the Federal Reserve. So you don't think that was a coincidence? The act had been used to confiscate the property of interned natives of Germany and more. This is described by Daniel A. Gross in his article, "The U.S. Confiscated $500 million in Private Property During World War I," whose subtitle reads, quote, "American home front was the site of internment, deportation, and vast property seizure," close quote. Apparently, all the U.S. public was now the enemy. Well, no, not the U.S. public, the people. Think about this. People who were simply protecting themselves and their families from the actions of the Federal Reserve System were accused of hoarding gold and literally criminalized if they persisted in doing so. The rationale is incredible. You are holding gold, so we will take it and do what with it? Hoard it. As we have seen, once they have taken the gold from the public, they did not then use the resource to expand credit. People remained in a debt trap. The deprivation continued and even worsened. Clearly, the need to expand credit served only as a pretext for the confiscation of the public's gold, which was the real predetermined objective. I asked my father why people had turned in their gold. He said that if you did not, you were a criminal. But further, that there was nothing you'd be able to do with it because you could not legally transport or sell it. So essentially, the use and value of gold had been confiscated. It was certainly the case because it remained illegal for a U.S. person. Notice that, again, what I'm getting at here. U.S. person. Not we the people, right? So he gave the order. By the way, if you read that executive order, it says exactly that, all U.S. persons. And what is the definition of a person under the U.S. Code? It's an infant. Under Title I, United States Code, subsection 8. Definition of a person is an infant. So all the infants had to turn in their stuff. Okay, well, what if you're not an infant? Yeah, exactly. Here are some excerpts from the executive order 6102. All persons are hereby required to deliver on or before May 1st, which, by the way, is the Luciferian high holiday, 1933, to a Federal Reserve Bank or branch or agency thereof, or any member bank of the Federal Reserve System, all gold, coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them or coming into their ownership. Whoever willfully violates any provision of this executive order may be fined not more than $10,000, or, if a natural person, may be imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. And notice that. What's a natural person? A natural person is, the definition of the law, a natural person is someone who has the capacity for rights and duties, right? So also a natural person is an infant, because an infant has a capacity for rights and duties, but until they come of full age, they can't hold title, nor can they actually execute their will. That's the core of what they're doing. Now, this book doesn't get into that, but anybody who's studied the Vocational Science of Freedom information knows this. All right, to continue. Note that the penalties were quite severe, and that all gold was literally to be turned over to the Federal Reserve System. How nice. Now we can see the purpose of constructing, in 1923, the largest bank vault in the world and a fortified building. Right, with gun turrets. Perhaps gold will not be confiscated immediately this time around. Gold has not been targeted as the essential collateral backing, as was the case under the Federal Reserve Act. In this go-around, it is securities of all kinds globally, which have been set up as the collateral backing underpinning the derivatives complex. Right, and remember this. Your birth certificate is a negotiable instrument. Okay? It's printed on bond paper. It's a negotiable instrument. It's basically a warehouse receipt. So it is a type of security. So know that. That's what they're coming for. The big banks are organized as holding companies with subsidiaries. The purpose of this structure is to legally separate risk. A subsidiary can be designed to take on liabilities which cannot attach to assets in other subsidiaries or to the holding company. Right, like the DTCC. The weakened subsidiary can be separately bankrupted. It is quite possible that the big banks have suppressed the price of gold by selling paper gold in subsidiaries, which will be allowed to fail, while accumulating physical gold in other subsidiaries which are designed to survive. This, however, does not assure that you, as a member of the Great Unwashed, will be allowed to keep your gold. Not if this juggernaut continues in motion. Well, you keep it anyway, and anybody who comes to take it, you summarily execute them, because first-time offense under common law for thievery is death, so just kill him. I recall the words of my father, who had lived through all of this. Quote, "The only thing they can't take from you is your education," close quote. Only the Federal Reserve System was designed to survive and take over all assets and banking activities. Only the Federal Reserve banks and those selected and controlled by the Federal Reserve were allowed to reopen. The Federal Reserve was also indemnified by the government, i.e. the public, for any losses. Indemnified, by the way, means promise to pay, in case anybody doesn't know. And so large-scale closures of banks and taking of bank deposits is not unprecedented. Holders of cash in banks are unsecured creditors with no enforceable claim to their money. Starting to get the point. It has been promised that there will be no taxpayer bailout this time, as if that is a good thing. Why? Simply because this will allow the banks to be closed rather than nationalized. Then all deposits and assets will be taken by the protected class of secured creditors. This is where this is going. Exactly. Make no doubt in the mind that's where this is going. Some wealthy people may think they will hide from this by keeping their money with the too-big-to-fail banks. Perhaps it will seem that they have succeeded in this through the early stages of the banking crisis. However, this regime shift is designed to be all-encompassing. Ordinarily, the deposit-taking subsidiaries should be quite secure, but a strategy has been set up so that the deposit-taking subsidiaries of the quote-unquote too-big-to-fail banks can be separately bankrupted when the time comes. How can we know that? The Fed has the power to give exemptions to any bank to move derivatives into deposit-taking subsidiaries, and it has done so. It has been tested, and on a large scale, apparently, it is easily and unilaterally done by the Fed by granting exemptions to Section 23A of the Federal Reserve Act. Here are some excerpts from a Bloomberg News article from 2011. Bank of America Corp., hit by a credit downgrade last month, has moved derivatives from its Merrill Lynch unit to a subsidiary flush with insured deposits, according to people with direct knowledge of the situation. The Fed has signaled that it favors moving the derivatives to give relief to the bank holding company. Bank of America's holding company, the parent of both the retail bank and the Merrill Lynch securities unit, held almost $75 trillion of derivatives at the end of June. About $53 trillion, or 71%, were within Bank of America N.A., according to the data, which represented the notional values of the trades. That compares with JP Morgan's deposit-taking entry, JP Morgan Chase Bank N.A., which contained 99% of the New York-based firm's $79 trillion of notional derivatives. Moving derivatives contracts between units of a bank holding company is limited under Section 23A of the Federal Reserve Act, which is designed to prevent a lender's affiliates from benefiting from its federal subsidiary and to protect the bank from excessive risk organizing at the non-bank affiliate, said Saul T. Amorova, a law professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill School of Law. As if that was some sort of excuse. It's not an excuse. They just literally admitted to what they were doing. In 2009, the Fed granted Section 23A exemptions to the banking arms of Allied Financial Incorporated, HSBC Holdings, Fifth Third Bank Corp., ING Group, General Electric Corp., Northern Trust Corp., which is what DTC is part of, CIT Group, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs Group Incorporated, among others. And here are some excerpts from another article in the same subject. Bank of America has shifted about $22 trillion worth of derivatives obligations from Merrill Lynch and the BAC holding company to the FDIC insured retail deposit division. Along with this information came the revelation that the FDIC insured unit was already stuffed with $53 trillion worth of these potentially toxic obligations, creating a total of $75 trillion. Right. All paper, nothing. This is backed by nothing. The literal creation out of nothing of the money. Now they create all these derivatives and everything else out of nothing to create more potential to take and steal the real assets when they collapse it. They've just figured out a much better way to expand their net much larger than they ever have before because people were stupid enough to go along with their Ponzi schemes. That's pretty much what's happening. To continue, this all has the blessing of the Federal Reserve, which approved the transfer of derivatives from Merrill Lynch to the insured retail unit of BAC before it was done. This is not an isolated instance. JP Morgan Chase is being allowed to house its unstable derivatives obligations within its FDIC insured retail banking unit. Other big banks do the same. End of the article. Keep in mind, when you see the scale of the derivative positions in these individual banks, that the size of the entire global economy was about $74 trillion in 2011. So individual banks had derivatives books the size of the entire global economy, and they moved them into their deposit-taking subsidiaries with the approval of the Fed? Why has this been tested on such a large scale? It seems they are quite serious about something. Is the intent to make the deposit-taking subsidiary safer? What is the real purpose? Used at the appropriate time, this will assure the collapse of the deposit-taking subsidiaries of the too-big-to-fail banks, allowing the taking of money comprehensively, including from depositors in these deposit-taking subsidiaries, leaving essentially no money anywhere and no pockets of resilience or of potential resilience. Meanwhile, in the chaos of the ensuing global wave of insolvencies, peppered with contrived existential threats, the quote-unquote protected class of banking holding companies and their subsidiaries designed for continuance will not only survive but thrive, taking essentially all collateral. Well, this is the point. This is the point right here. So global thieves are going to try and take everything from you? Sorry, it's not going to happen. When global thieves come and try to take everything, everybody's going to resist and kill anybody who acts as a stupid goon for the global thieves. Period, full stop. Because we all know what's coming this time. The last couple of times that they've tried this in history, the people really weren't aware of what was coming. Well, now we do. Because of something called the internet. Everybody's warned everybody. Somebody knows that's in every single community everywhere. And I don't really care what community it is, and I'm not talking just about America. This is known all around the world now, particularly because of the release of this book. But aside from this, forensic historians and those who study the history of law have seen this throughout history. It's not anything new. I don't really care what their mechanisms are. This is their modus operandi. So, to continue, this will be put forth as an imperative, i.e., that they must survive and be strong for the sake of humanity, so that the system might begin again, and we all might move forward. People will be desperate and simply want the terror to stop. Well, guess what? I think all of the terror should be put on them. We should all band together. We should do what we need to do, be self-sufficient, self-reliant, and get local on everything. To continue, what fig leaf will depositors have to protect them from the quote-unquote protected class? The Deposit Insurance Fund, DIF, of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was $128.2 billion as of December 31st, 2022. The FDIC is required to fund the DIF to 1.35% of insured depositors. The DIF can be exhausted, and indeed has been totally depleted twice, in the savings and loan crisis and the financial global crisis. In these instances, FDIC was allowed to borrow funds from the Federal Financing Bank. The FDIC had a line of credit with the Treasury for up to $100 billion. If this credit line were fully utilized, total resources would be $228 billion, roughly 2% of insured deposits. So if the entire banking system is insolvent, insured, quote-unquote insured depositors, get 2 cents on the dollar. That will not go far in a widespread banking crisis. Or if the deposit-taking subsidiary of a major bank is bankrupted, e.g. Bank of America and JP Morgan have over $2 trillion and $2.5 trillion in deposits, respectively. In Europe, banking union was initiated in 2012, supposedly as a response to the quote-unquote Eurozone crisis. This has transferred responsibility from banking policy from the national level to the EU level in 21 countries. Sweden has thus far resisted pressure from its own central bank to join the banking union. Denmark and Poland have signed but not yet ratified the treaty. The objective, I believe, was to create a construct, the goal of which is preventing stabilization of banks through nationalization under the simplistic pretext that as the wind down of the banks will be handled entirely privately, no taxpayer funds will be used, with the exception of just stealing everybody's funds. Resolution powers over the captured banking systems, including around 3,000 banks and other financial institutions, have been conferred to a resolution authority, the Single Resolution Board, which will still execute a single resolution mechanism. A single resolution fund will be used for the exercise of resolution powers. The Single Resolution Fund is comprised of contributors from credit institutions and certain investment firms in the participating member states within the banking union. The SRF must, by law, reach the target level of at least 1% of covered deposits by December 31st, 2023, at which time the deposit insurance regime is intended to be fully mutualized among the member states. The SRF is protected by approximately 80 billion euro at that point. A revolving credit line from European Stability Mechanism will match the SRF, stepping up total backing to 2% of covered deposits, approximately 160 billion euro. Right, they're setting up the same system there as they have here. They're going to give everybody 2%, and thereby reaching harmonization with the level of 2% backing of deposits in the U.S. Right, what I just said. The SRB is now aiming to capture and incorporate into the SRM the legacy national deposit guarantee schemes. The SRB has a problem with something called super priority. In bankruptcy, super priority claims rank with or even above those of secured creditors. Oh, so now we have another term in here. Super priority claims. All right. The SRB has stated that super priority claims of DGS makes it de facto unrealistic to use DGS funds in resolution, close quote. Okay. The SRB has further stated that, quote, the SRB supports removing the DGS super priority and adopting a general depositor preference, close quote. Why do they object to super priority for DGS? While these funds are quite small, with super priority, the funds used from national DGS would certainly be recovered from the assets of the bank and thus could be reused. It would give the national DGS a seat at the table alongside the senior secured creditors, potentially involving the state in each resolution process. Oh, that's why. Okay. The SRB absolutely does not want that. Yeah, precisely. They don't want anybody being able to change what they're doing. They are attempting to force agreement that these funds will be treated as a general depositor preference, which would put any such funds just ahead of unsecured creditors, but behind secured creditor. Practically speaking, this means that the funds would not be recovered and would be wiped out in the first major failure. That seems to be the objective. Super priority is only for the protected class. The public can only be allowed in appearance of protection. Sounds about right. The Single Resolution Board has directed the biggest banks to prepare for solvent wind down, SWD. Again, that sounds like a good thing, but given the scale of the bubble, this cannot possibly mean the solvency of the entire banking system. I suggest that what this means is the preparation for certain proportions of the biggest banks to remain solvent. Same thing they did in 33. Here are some excerpts from the SRB memo, Solvent Wind Down of Trading Books, Guidance for Banks 2022. All GSIBs, globally systematically important banks, are expected to work on SWD planning as a RPC, Resolution Planning Cycle, 2022 priority. Other banks will be identified and approached in the course of 2022 following a further assessment of the significance of their trading books to work on SWD planning as a RPC 2023 priority. GSIBs are expected to prepare to plan and ensure that capabilities are ready to deliver, quote unquote, day one. Expectations in 2022, while other banks approached in 2022 are expected to deliver on these in 2023. Banks should take all necessary steps to ensure that all, quote unquote, day one SWD related expectations are implemented on time. Here are further excerpts from the work program of 2023. The SRB's 2023 work program is set against a backdrop of great uncertainty. While the start of 2022 saw economies beginning to emerge from the pandemic, 2023 will see added challenges, in part stemming from Russian aggression in Ukraine, rising energy costs having led to double-digit inflation in many parts of the banking union. Well, where did that come from? That came from the communist Joe Biden going along with the Luciferians' plan and shutting off our domestic energy supply. That was all part and parcel of it. And the rest of the hyperinflation that no one can stop anyway. But to continue. Now more than ever, it is important we finalize the work on banking resolvability and ensure that all of the goals set out in the SRB's expectations for banks are met before the year is out. This was the initial target date, and we are on track to meet it. The coming 12 months will see the SRB's focus moving from the more general phase of drafting and fine-tuning of resolution plans towards ensuring that each plan and preferred resolution strategy for each bank is implementable at short notice. Right, because they're going to trigger this whenever they can, and they want everything in place beforehand. At the same time, crisis preparations needs to be further strengthened to equip the SRB with all tools needed to react to a looming crisis, implement a resolution scheme, and manage any necessary reconstructing of the bank. It is clear that more harmonized European measures are the way forward, rather than renationalizing and weakening European financial stability tools. Yeah, right. Neville, see, this is when you hear this language, you hear the attorney, because these are all attorneys writing this. You hear the intent, right? So, what is the intent? What's the absolute goal? A one world government and no nations exist. That's the goal, right? So you hear all of this rather than renationalizing. See, whenever they hate the word national, in general, attorneys do, because they all work for the Luciferian globalists. So in the actual language, you hear the plan, if you know what you're listening for, right? The goal is no nations at all. None. Zero. So if there's any doubt about that, you just reread that last sentence. To continue, nevertheless, there will always be losses when a bank gets into trouble. Resolution is not a miracle fix-all solution. Rather, it is about attributing and sharing the losses a bank suffers. Right. Why should we suffer the loss of anything that a bank does? Right? Shouldn't. Particularly because Article 1, Section 10 of the Federal Constitution states that no state shall make anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debt. Right. So how did that ever get worked around? Think about it. To continue. The year 2023 will be the last of a transitional period for the establishment of the main elements of the resolution framework in the banking union. And that's the end of the article. It seems that we are getting very close to showtime. An indication that powers that be are extremely serious can be seen in the SRB press release from 2022. Principals of U.S. European Banking Union and UK financial authorities meet for regular coordination exercise on cross-border resolution planning. God, is that a mouthful? The heads of resolution, regulatory and supervisory authorities, central banks and financial ministries of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Banking Union are among leaders participating in a trilateral principal level exercise on Saturday, April 23, 2022. The meeting is part of a series of regular exercises and exchanges among the principals of these key financial sector authorities to enhance understanding of each jurisdiction's resolution regime for global, systematically important banks and to strengthen coordination on cross-border resolution. This exercise builds on 6 prior cross-border principal level events going back to 2014. I've been at this for a while. With the European Banking Union authorities joining in 2016. From the U.S., the participants are expected to include the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, the President of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Acting Chairman of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Acting Comptroller of the Currency. By the way, this is a perfect list of everybody that you should serve with any notice prior to them doing this, as to the fact that you know what they're up to. I'm just saying. The Chairman of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Participants from the European Banking Union include principals from the Single Resolution Board, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank. Participants from the United Kingdom include participants from HM Treasury and the Bank of England. And this is, of course, the Bank of England has always been controlled by the Rothschilds. So anyway, all right. This level of attention from the U.S. side is extremely unusual. I've never seen anything like this happen, let alone several times in 8 years. It's almost as if they are planning something quite serious. The Atlantic Council is a think tank which, quote unquote, creates a meeting place, close quote, for heads of state, military, and institutional leaders. It is a member of the Atlantic Treaty Association, an umbrella organization which draws together political leaders, academics, military officials, and diplomats to support the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Right, just another precursor to world government. The focus of the Atlantic Council is military strategy, not economics. And what is the Atlantic Council focusing on now? Central bank digital currency, which is virtual money backed and issued directly by central banks. The Atlantic Council has quite a nice CBDC tracker. Here one can see that, as of this writing, central banks in 114 countries, representing 95% of the global economy, were working on CBDCs, that 11 countries have fully launched digital currency, and that all G7 economies are now moved into the development stage of CBDC, and that 18 of the G20 countries are now in the advanced stage of development. Right, so when this comes out, under no circumstances use it. Just don't use it. Keep trading in gold and silver locally with everyone who has a service or a product that you need. And you'd better set up these systems now. You better set up the trading, getting to know who is around you, finding out who's truly knowledgeable in this. And if none of them are, well, then just give them these recordings. Let them come out of it at their own volition. And then move on, because you don't have time to be playing around or trying to pull one person up out of the sand right now. You have to mass teach everybody. Tell them what's coming. Try and save as many as you can, but just know that a lot of them are going to be destroyed in the flood because they're not going to do what they need to do. Just how this all works out. All right, back to this. So why is this happening now globally? Is it really a desire to bring, quote unquote, financial inclusion to the disadvantaged? Why would the Atlantic Council, a military strategy think tank, focus on CBDCs? We are living within a global hybrid war, a component of which will be the collapse of the banking, money, and payments systems globally. Because they have to shut down all of it globally so they can institute what? Their new world order. War aims will be achieved by means other than kinetic war. The foremost aim of the people who have privately controlled the central banks and money creation is that they will remain in power forever. They can risk no pockets of resistance. Right, which is why everyone needs to be not a pocket of resistance, but why everyone needs to simply resist. Period. Full stop. Do not use anything that they give you. Do not follow any law. Do not follow any statute that they send your way and say, you have to obey this now. Sorry, that's Roman civil law. Show me where I've entered into contract or agreed to be subject to your stupidity. Right? Follow common law, follow natural law. If you have to indict people that do bad things in your area, fine. Convene a grand jury of 25 members of the peerage. If you can't get 25, you're in an area that you got trouble. You should be able to have 25 people, no problem, to convene whenever you need to take care of matters locally. And remember, the grand jury is above all government. So that's it. You have your militia to protect them, and you form a grand jury. When I have smaller courts, that's fine. Have the courts of record that then proceed according to the course of the common law. So the grand jury brings the indictment, the superior court of common law with the 12 petite jury determine the facts in the law, and you get things done. And then you execute judgment, whatever that may be. Public hanging, no problem. That can all be done in a common law. And no one can take that from you unless you believe that they can take it from you. Or if you fail to start exercising your rights to use it the way that you feel the necessity to use it. Because he who slumbers on his rights has none. That's a maxim of law. So we need to stop slumbering. You start acting. Start exercising your rights. Start doing what you need to do to prepare for this. To continue. Augustin Carstens is the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. One can see the following comments of his, which have, quote unquote, gone viral just after the 24-minute mark in the video of the virtual meeting titled Cross-Border Payments, A Vision for the Future. We don't know who's using a $100 bill today, and we don't know who's using a 1,000 peso bill today. The key difference with the CBDC is the central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that. That's a pretty important paragraph. Now, not to say that they don't enforce it in a certain aspect anyway, because you got to realize, under the United States Code, all crimes, federal crimes, are commercial. That's laid down in the Code of Federal Regulations. I forget the exact number. Maybe somebody can remember in chat. But it clearly says, under the Roman civil law of the Federal United States Corporation, that all crimes are commercial. Why? Because it's all about how you use that Federal Reserve note. So it's not yours in the first place. It's a debt obligation. From what? Federal government. To who? Federal Reserve. Can they determine how people use that? Sure. But they can't determine how people decide to use gold and silver because it's not theirs. They didn't create it. That which you create, you can control. That's more or less a maxim of law as well. So just remember that, okay? In other words, CBDC means absolute control. And so if the quote-unquote old money system somehow collapses, new money will be provided by the central banks in the form of central bank digital currency, the new and improved control system. Imagine it is chaos. You've lost everything. But your smartphone, if you don't have one, don't worry, you'll be issued one. You will download an app. You'll click boxes agreeing to everything. You'll become increasingly indebted with each payment you make using the CBDC you are quote-unquote given on your phone. You'll be told what to do and what not to do from then on. You will comply if you want to eat. Unless, of course, you grow your own garden. So, I will stop here, make a note, to come back to the next chapter. Chapter 9, The Great Deflation. And this has been the reading of The Great Taking, and this has been the Vocational Science of Freedom Saturday Night Civics and Sovereignty class. And I thank all of you for coming. I thank all of you for listening online. Please share this with others who may not know what's coming. And make sure to give them a copy of the book, which is in the mega link in the show notes. Hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And until next time, stay safe and stay sovereign.